The smell of burnt coffee and old paper hit Renata the moment she stepped into the elevator for the last time. It was the kind of detail that shouldn't matter. She had a driver waiting downstairs, a lawyer calling every 15 minutes, and a board that had just voted 11-2 to remove her as chief executive officer of Harwick Capital Management, the firm she had built from a one-room office in Cincinnati into a $2 billion investment house. The coffee smell shouldn't have mattered at all, but it did, because she was the one who had always kept the good beans in her office, and whoever had taken her corner suite on the 31st floor had already switched back to the cheap stuff from the kitchen cart. 12 hours. That's how long it had taken. The elevator doors closed. The numbers counted down. Renata stared at her own reflection in the brushed steel and did not recognize the woman looking back at her. 3 months earlier, everything had been fine, or fine enough. That was how she would later describe it to the one person who asked. Not good, not thriving, just fine enough that she hadn't noticed the cracks. Harwick had been under pressure since the fourth quarter of the previous year. A series of bad calls on regional bank exposure, then the portfolio rebalancing that came 2 weeks too late, then the wire fraud investigation that turned out to involve a mid-level compliance officer named Terrence, who had been siphoning client fees into a shell account in Delaware for the better part of 4 years. None of it was Renata's doing directly. Every forensic auditor who looked at the books said the same thing. But she was the CEO. She had hired Terrence. She had approved the compliance structure that made his scheme possible. And when the institutional client started pulling out, first quietly, then loudly, then in a way that made the financial press, she was the face attached to the damage. The board had been patient. She gave them credit for that. 7 months of patience, which in the world of institutional asset management was essentially geological in scale. But patience has a balance, and she had spent it down to 0. The vote came on a Thursday morning. She had known it was coming. Her assistant, a woman named Becca, who had been with her for 6 years, had cried while packing the framed photos from Renata's desk. The photo of Renata shaking hands with the mayor at the ribbon cutting. The photo of her at her MBA graduation, 22 years old, wearing shoes that were half a size too big because she couldn't afford the right pair. That one she made sure to take herself. She tucked it under her arm and walked out. The first week, she stayed in her apartment and waited for the phone to ring. It rang constantly, but never with the right voices. Journalists, lawyers, a former college roommate who had seen the story on LinkedIn and wanted to check in, which meant she wanted details. Renata let most of it go to voicemail. She ordered Thai food and watched 3 seasons of a documentary series about deep-sea creatures and told herself she was resting. She was not resting. She was hiding. The second week, her attorney advised her to stop talking to anyone outside their legal team until the SEC inquiry concluded. He said it calmly, the way attorneys say things that are actually quite alarming. She sat across from him in his office on Michigan Avenue and nodded and thought about the fact that she had not spoken to another human being in a natural, unguarded way in longer than she could remember. The third week, the money ran out. Not all of it. She wasn't destitute. But the attorneys cost more than she'd expected. The apartment lease was up for renewal at a rate that no longer made any sense given that she had no income, and the assets she'd been planning to liquidate were tied up in a freeze order pending the investigation. She moved out of the apartment on a Tuesday. She put 3 boxes in storage and took 2 suitcases to a budget, extended stay hotel on the north side of the city, the kind of place with a vending machine in the lobby and a laminated card in the room explaining the checkout procedure. She stood in the center of that room for a long time after the bellhop left. There was a water stain on the ceiling shaped roughly like the state of Florida. The window faced a parking structure. The bedspread had a pattern of small beige diamonds that, if she looked at it too long, seemed to pulse. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and did not cry, because she had decided a long time ago that crying was something she would do when she was alone and safe, and this room did not feel like either of those things yet. She started going to a diner on Waveland Avenue because it was the cheapest place within walking distance, and because no one there seemed to own a smartphone or read the financial press. It was called Costas. It had been there since 1971, according to the hand-lettered sign above the register. The booths were red vinyl, the menus were laminated and slightly sticky. She went there every morning and ordered one coffee and one egg on toast and made it last as long as she could, because it gave her somewhere to be. On her fourth visit, she noticed the man in the booth across from hers. He was there before her and still there when she left, working on a laptop with one hand and cutting up a pancake with the other, periodically feeding small pieces to the little girl sitting beside him. The girl was maybe 4, maybe 5. She had a yellow bow in her hair that was slightly lopsided, the way bows go when a person who doesn't usually do bows is the one who put it there. She was telling a story about a duck with great seriousness, and the man was nodding and responding in a voice too low to hear, and he did not once look at his phone. Renata watched them for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she looked back at her coffee. She had seen the man before, not here, she was certain of that, somewhere else. The memory sat at the edge of her mind, just out of reach, the way memories do when you're tired and underfed and spending too much time alone with a water-stained ceiling. His name was Aaron Price. She placed it on the 6th morning, when he came in wearing a fleece vest with a logo on the chest. A small, simple word mark she recognized from her own building, or what had been her building. He was an analyst, junior level. She had seen him twice, maybe 3 times, in the context of all-staff meetings where she stood at a podium and spoke about quarterly performance and culture and vision, and all the other words that mean something and nothing at the same time. She did not know his name until she looked at the vest. What she did know, what came back to her slowly, the way things do when you've been trying not to think about them, was the morning she had signed his termination paperwork. It had been 18 months ago, a Friday in November. She'd been in the middle of a board call that ran long, and her chief of staff had slid a folder across the table to her with a yellow sticky note that said Final Approvals, EOD. She had signed 6 documents without reading them carefully. The price termination was one of them. The reason listed was restructuring, position eliminated. She had seen 50 of those in her career and had long since stopped looking for the story beneath the form. Later, much later, the following Monday, her HR director had mentioned it in passing, the Price situation. It turned out that Aaron Price had left a client presentation midway through to go to a hospital. His daughter. Something acute and terrifying that turned out, fortunately, not to be as catastrophic as the first hours suggested, but for 12 hours no one knew that. He had called in, explained the situation, been told by the mid-level manager running the presentation that his presence was mandatory and his absence would be noted. He had left anyway. His absence was noted, in the form of a folder on her desk on a Friday afternoon. Renata had not gone back and unsigned the paperwork. She had told herself there were processes for these things, and that she couldn't make individual exceptions without undermining the structure, and that if she started pulling threads, everything would unravel. She had told herself that and moved on, because moving on was what she did. She was not moving on now. She was sitting in a diner on Waveland Avenue, watching the man she had fired feed pancakes to his daughter. She paid for her coffee and left before he could look up. For the next 4 days, she chose a different diner. It was farther away and more expensive, and the coffee was worse, and none of those things were the real reason she'd switched, but she let herself believe they were. On the 5th day, she went back to Costas because the other place had raised their egg price, and because she was tired of punishing herself for things she hadn't actually decided to do yet. He was already there. He looked up when she came in, the way people do when a door opens, and their eyes met for just a second, long enough for her to feel the recognition move through her and wonder if it moved through him too. Then he looked back at his daughter, who was explaining something involving a dragon and a swimming pool with complete confidence in her audience's attention. Renata took a different booth that day, closer to the window. She ordered her coffee and looked out at the parking lot and thought about nothing in particular with great intensity. A few minutes later, she heard the little girl's voice rise to the pitch children use when they are performing for an expanded audience. She glanced over. The girl had turned in her seat and was looking directly at Renata with the frank, assessing stare that small children deploy before adult self-consciousness sets in. "You have red buttons," the girl said. Renata looked down at her coat. She did have red buttons. "I do," she said. "I have a button that's shaped like a star," the girl said. "It's on my other jacket." "That sounds better than mine," Renata said. The girl considered this. "They're equal," she decided, and turned back around. Renata felt something shift in her chest. Some small locked thing she hadn't noticed was there until it moved. She did not look over at Aaron Price. She did not need to see his expression to know that he had been watching. She ran into him at the register 3 mornings later. They were both reaching for the small bowl of individually wrapped mints that Costas kept near the cash register, the kind of moment that forces acknowledgement whether you want it or not. He stepped back. She did too. Then he smiled, not a big smile, just the polite version, the social lubricant, and said, "Go ahead, thank you," she said. She paid, he waited. She could feel him recognizing her, or not recognizing her, or some combination of the two, and she took her change and turned toward the door. "Mrs. Harwick," he said. She stopped. She turned around slowly, the way you turn when you're not sure what direction the thing you're facing is going to come from. He was not smiling now. He wasn't frowning either. His expression was something careful and even, the expression of a person who has thought about a moment and decided in advance not to be driven by it. "Aaron Price," he said, "I worked at your firm. Quantitative analysis, 3rd floor. I know who you are," she said. A beat passed. The woman at the register pretended to be very interested in the credit card terminal. "Okay," he said. He nodded once, the way you nod when something is confirmed rather than resolved. "Have a good morning." He didn't say it with venom. He didn't say it with performance. He said it the way you say it when you mean it, or have at least decided to mean it. And that was somehow worse than anything else he could have done. She went back to the hotel and sat by the window that faced the parking structure and thought about 18 months ago and a folder on a Friday afternoon. She thought about the fact that she had fired a man for choosing his sick child over a sales presentation. She thought about the fact that she had not known that was what she was doing and had not tried to find out. She thought about all the distance that had grown between her decisions and the people they landed on, all the insulation that her title and her calendar and her chief of staff had provided, and she thought about how the insulation had felt like efficiency and turned out to be something else. She had run a firm. She had been good at it, by most measurable standards. She had also, in the specific and unambiguous way that matters, not been good at it at all. She sat there for a long time, long enough for the light in the parking structure to change from morning gray to afternoon white, long enough for the vending machine in the hallway to cycle through its hum twice. Then she picked up her phone and called her attorney and asked him to estimate, as precisely as possible, when the asset freeze would be lifted and what she would have access to first. He told her. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. She wrote the number down on the hotel notepad, the one with the logo printed in faded blue at the top, and looked at it for a while. The next morning she arrived at Costas earlier than usual. She sat in her regular booth and waited. She had brought a notepad of her own, a legal pad she'd bought at the Walgreens 2 blocks over. She hadn't written anything on it yet. She wasn't sure she was going to. He came in at 7:40, the same as always, his daughter, holding his hand and talking about something that had happened at preschool, involving a disagreement over crayons that was clearly still unresolved. He settled her into the booth, handed her the kids' menu to color on, and placed his order without looking at the full menu. He'd been coming here long enough to know it by heart. He did not look over at Renata. She waited until his coffee arrived. Then she stood up, walked to his booth, and stopped at the edge of the table. "I'd like to speak with you," she said, "if you're willing." He looked up. His daughter looked up too, with the yellow bow still slightly lopsided. "About what?" he said. "About what I did," she said, "and about something I want to offer. Those are 2 separate things, and I want you to know they're separate before I say anything else." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his daughter, who had gone back to coloring the kids' menu with focused intensity. "5 minutes," he said. She sat down across from him. She started with the apology. She had rehearsed it, which she felt slightly ashamed of. But she had learned a long time ago that unrehearsed apologies tend to become explanations, and explanations tend to become defenses, and defenses are the opposite of what she was trying to do. So she had rehearsed it, and she delivered it as plainly as she could, and she did not excuse anything. She told him she had signed his termination without understanding what she was signing. She told him that not understanding was not an excuse, that she had created a structure in which she could sign things without understanding them, and had never questioned whether that structure was acceptable. She told him she was sorry for what the termination had cost him, the income, the momentum, whatever else he'd had to figure out in the aftermath, and she said it without flinching, because flinching would have been for her benefit and not his. He listened. He didn't interrupt. His expression stayed that same careful, even thing. When she finished, he said, "My daughter's name is Ren. The day I left the presentation, she had a febrile seizure. She was fine by the next morning, but I didn't know that when I left." "I know," Renata said. "I found out after, and you didn't reverse the decision." "No," she said. "I didn't." Another beat. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Ren had filled in an entire illustrated fish with orange crayon and moved on to purple for its fins. "What's the offer?" he said. She told him. She'd been thinking about it for 3 days, had refined it through the long hours in the hotel room with the beige diamond bedspread. She was starting over, not by choice, but because starting over was what the situation called for. She had capital coming available in 30 to 60 days, not enough to rebuild what she'd had, but enough to structure a small advisory practice. She needed a quantitative analyst, someone who was good at the work and wasn't doing it for the title, because there wasn't going to be a title that impressed anyone for a while. She was offering him a job, a real one, with a real salary at market rate, and a role that wasn't going to be eliminated the next time someone left a folder on her desk on a Friday afternoon. She said all of this without asking him to feel anything about it. She was not offering it as penance. She was offering it because she needed the skill and he had it, and she wanted him to know that those were the only 2 reasons, so that if he said no, it was clean, and if he said yes, it was clean. He sat with it. He looked at his coffee. He looked at Ren, who had discovered a cheerful satisfaction in coloring the illustrated fish's eye an aggressive yellow. "I have another offer I'm considering," he said finally. "That's fine," she said. "I'd want a written agreement up front. Not a handshake, of course, and flexibility for school pickup. Non-negotiable. Non-negotiable," she agreed. He nodded slowly. "I'll think about it," he said. She stood up. She picked up her legal pad, which she still hadn't written anything on. "Thank you for the 5 minutes," she said. "Mrs. Harwick," he said. She looked back. "For what it's worth," he said, and he said it carefully. "The way you say things you've decided to say, even though you didn't expect to. I don't think you were a bad person. I think you were a person who stopped paying attention to what your decisions were actually doing. That's different." She stood there with her legal pad and looked at him. "I think that's probably more generous than I deserve," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But I've got a 4-year-old who already thinks she's the moral authority in every room she enters. I'm trying to model the appropriate response to that." Ren, without looking up from the fish, said, "That's because I am." Something happened in Renata's chest again. That same small unlocking, more deliberate this time, like a window being opened in a room that hadn't had air in a while. She almost smiled. She caught herself. Then she decided that catching herself was exactly the kind of thing she was trying to stop doing. She smiled. The asset freeze lifted 41 days later. By then, Aaron had accepted the offer. They had signed the written agreement, which her attorney had drafted, and which Aaron had read in full and proposed 2 amendments to, both of which were reasonable and which she accepted. He had turned down the other offer. She didn't ask from whom, and he didn't explain his reasoning, and she didn't need him to. She signed a lease on a two-room office on the 14th floor of a building in River North. It was not a corner office. It did not have floor-to-ceiling windows. It had adequate light and a reasonable rent and a coffee maker she brought herself, with the good beans, because some things you don't compromise on, even when you're rebuilding. On the first morning, she came in early and stood in the center of the office and looked at the walls, which were blank. She had brought the photograph, the one from her graduation, with the shoes that were half a size too big. She put it on the desk facing out, so it was the first thing she'd see when she sat down. She was 43 years old. She had made something, lost it, and done damage on the way. She was going to make something again, and the doing of it was going to require her to remember every single day that the distance between a decision and its consequences is not a feature, it's a warning. Aaron arrived 20 minutes later, Wren's yellow bow visible for a moment in the hallway behind him before she ran off toward the elevator bank, apparently having discovered that the buttons were very satisfying to press. "She'll be at preschool in 40 minutes, he said, by way of explanation. "The buttons on this floor go all the way to 17, Renata said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'll get her back in 35, he said. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop and started working. The city was bright outside the windows that didn't go floor to ceiling. The coffee maker hummed on the counter she'd bought from the office supply place down the block. In the hallway, she could hear the elevator chiming, once, then again, then a third time, and the small voice of a child who had found, in a building full of people, beginning and ending and beginning again, exactly the thing she was looking for.